Abe Moskowitz was in his 80s when I went to work with him at Radio Shack while I was in college. And Abe was a sales trainer for the store. And the very first thing that he told me was that in dealing with people, there are three truths. There is the customer's truth, there is my truth, and then there is the real truth, which rests somewhere between the customer and me. And if I wanted to be successful, I had to be willing to meet the customer halfway between my truth and her truth. The lesson Abe was teaching was how to work with customers. But the larger lesson was about the power of perceptions. Our perceptions are powerful forces in our lives because through them we define ourselves, our relationships, the world we live in. And unfortunately, our perceptions are so powerful that we can become blind and fail to see the reality before us. And there are some old experiments that test and prove this theory out, one of which you have in your folders today, in your bulletins. This is a picture that has been used in experiments for decades about perception. Now, some of you, when you look at this picture the first time, you'll see an older woman. And some of you who look at it will see a young woman. And some of you, very few of you, will see both. And the way the experiment has usually been conducted in classrooms is that half the class is given a picture of the old woman, the other half of the class is given a picture of the young woman, and they are asked to study the picture for a long time, and then the professor or teacher gathers them together and brings out this picture and says, "What do you see?" And those that have seen only the picture of the older woman say it's a picture of an old woman. And those who have seen only the picture of the young woman say, well, it's a picture of the young woman, and then they argue for the next 45 minutes or so of the class as to who is right. Not realizing that their perception had been conditioned to see what they saw in the picture. And there's another experiment that's also done that also seems to prove this out, and this is the way it works. The experimenters sit you down at a table in front of an ordinary deck of cards. And they flash 6 of them to you, asking you to identify them as fast as you can. 9 of diamonds, 3 of hearts, jack of, what was that last one? And then they will repeat the experiment a second time. And they'll slow it down a little so that you can get the ones that you missed before. And then the third time they do it so slow that you think you must be a fool because there is one card you simply cannot identify. You think you know what it is, but you're not really sure what it is. And it's not until the cards are laid on the table in front of you that you can see what the problem is. See, the mystery card is a 6 of spades. Only it's red. It's not black. See, the deck has been fixed. It's been changed. Someone has changed the rules. Rules that prevented you from seeing what was there. You couldn't see the red spade because we have all been conditioned and taught that in a deck of cards, spades are supposed to be black. And this is also what happened, by the way, according to Nate Silver, to the people who were supposed to be experts in rating financial investments in stocks and bonds. Those who tell you what is the most risky investments and those which are the really good and safe investments, but who dramatically and catastrophically misunderstood what would happen to those mortgage-based derivative investments when people started defaulting on their mortgages. You see, when they thought they knew how it was all going to work, and they thought they could accurately and precisely predict it. Except that their calculations were based on a perception about how mortgages worked when people were given mortgages they could afford to pay. Because that's the way it had always been done before. Unfortunately, mortgage lenders changed the deck by lending to people who they knew could never afford the mortgages that they were being given. And this is one of the things that led to the unraveling of our economy in 2008. Our perceptions are not only powerful in making us see something that isn't there or being blinded to what is there, but they drive our responses to events and to people. One person might experience an event as a wonderful, inspiring, exciting new beginning, while another person sees it as a death knell to everything that made sense of the world. One person might respond to a new person taking an important executive position in the company as a sign of a welcome change to the way that business has been done, while another person feels threatened and looks for ways to oppose or sabotage the new person so things might stay just as they are. In many ways, this is exactly what the gospel, according to Matthew, is telling us. People will respond to Jesus based upon their perception of who Jesus is, what Jesus is doing, and what Jesus' presence and ministry means for their life. And according to Matthew, those responses will largely be expressed in one of two ways. One of the ways it will be expressed is the way of the Magi responded. The other way will be the way Herod responded. The Magi, or magoi in the Greek, were men who knew a great deal about a lot of different things. They knew about medicine, astrology, astronomy, mathematics, the way to interpret dreams, and how to interpret celestial phenomena. And yet they also knew about the Judeans, knew the words of the Hebrew prophets. Now, to be clear, these men were not Hebrews and did not share Hebrew history. They were not descendants of Abraham, did not share Abraham's faith. However, they did know the Judeans because the Judeans had been taken into exile in Babylon and Syria, where they continued to worship God and hear the scriptures read. The Magi were not Hebrews, but they were religious men who had heard and learned the words of the prophets from Jeremiah and Micah to Isaiah and Zephaniah. So when they saw the great star blazing brilliantly, more brilliantly than all the other stars, they knew this star was a symbol that God's promise of a servant king for the Judeans was being kept. They knew this star was God's self-revelation to the world, that a new beginning was at hand for the Judeans and for all people. And they may even have remembered Isaiah's prophecy, "Arise and shine, for your light has come, the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, kings to the brightness of your dawn." And then remembering this prophecy, they realized this star was pointing them to the Epiphany, pointing them to God's self-revelation in the birth of the child who was to be the servant king, revealing God to the world and bringing into being God's way of justice, God's righteousness, God's way of being. This child will be reconciling people with each other and reconciling all people with God by revealing the intimate, committed, the joy-filled love that God has for all people. And so they packed up their offerings of gold because the child is a king, of frankincense because this child is a priest interceding with God on our behalf, and myrrh because this child heals all wounds. And then they followed the star to Bethlehem, where they would bow down, placing their gifts at the manger and confessing this child is Lord. The Magi respond to the sign of God's coming into the world and all the changes it means for human history and life by embracing it. Almost as saying, God is doing a new thing in the world. God is changing the world. Isn't that great? Let's go out and see how we can participate in that. Herod, on the other hand, doesn't respond that way. Indeed, as I hear Herod's response to the Magi's question about the whereabouts of the child who was born and who is the new king of the Jews, I wonder if Herod even knew this was happening. I kind of wonder if anyone really in Jerusalem knew that this was happening. I mean, didn't they see the star? Or if they saw the star, did they think it was just something that was happening there up in the sky and having nothing to do with them? And I say this because Herod seems bewildered that this has happened or was even supposed to happen. He calls together the chief priests, the scribes of the temple, asks them what the Magi are talking about. And they say to him, well, yeah, the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem of Judah, as was written by the prophets. You see, they know what the prophets said. They teach what the prophets said. They lead the people in worship. And yet, they don't seem all that ready to go with the Magi. They don't seem even interested enough to ask if they could go with the Magi. It's almost as though they don't think this has happened at all. Sort of like, well, sure, it's a prophecy, but, so what? It hasn't really happened. That star is just a big, bright light in the sky. And by the way, we have more important things to do than go searching around the countryside to see if this promise of God might have been kept. And while the chief priests and the scribes and the people of Jerusalem respond with at least a bit of disinterest, Herod responds with destructive fear. He is afraid because this is not a welcome change for him, because if there is a new king of the Jews, what will happen to Herod, who is the current and perhaps the old king of the Jews? Because obviously there can't be two kings. And Herod figures out that he will lose his throne, his palaces, his power, his wealth, his identity. He will lose the life he has so carefully, so cruelly constructed for himself. A life that he has constructed by allying himself with Rome and by playing off one powerful group of people off another powerful group of people through the politics of deceit and a willingness to kill anyone who gets in his way, including one of his wives and two of his sons, as well as building massive cities featuring oversized palaces and theaters and expanding the Jerusalem temple. And Herod does not like this news. And Herod is not going to stand idly by and lose everything because some child is born who is supposed to be king. Herod will do something about it, and he will use the Magi to help him. You see, when Herod asked the Magi to go and find the child, then come back and tell him where the child is so he can go and pay homage, he is lying. He has no intention of paying homage to this child. He intends to destroy this child, doing so because he mistakenly thinks he controls the world, believing he is the one who decides who lives and who dies, who believes he is God, which is the failure of his perception, blinding him to the reality that, like the Pharaoh before him, remember Pharaoh in Egypt before the Exodus? Well, just like that Pharaoh, Herod is in fact opposing God. Indeed, he declares war on God by seeking to destroy this child and forgetting one important fact when one goes to war against God. And that is that God always wins. Herod's response to God's presence is to fight to keep the status quo, since he is profiting from exploitation and oppression. He refuses to give up his power, his wealth, his status, his place in the world, because he wants life as he constructs it. In the gospel according to Matthew, we are told from the beginning of Jesus' life to his death and to his resurrection that people will either embrace God's self-revelation in Christ and Christ's revelation of God's presence and love by faithfully following him, or they will fail to see God's revealed presence and will oppose God's intention for the world because they are afraid of change and are determined to keep the status quo at all costs, and they want life as they construct it to be. And I believe that the hard question that individual Christians and congregations need to ask themselves today in the 21st century really is, how do I see the star? How do we see the star? How do you all see the star? Do we see God doing a new thing in the world and wonder how it will disrupt our lives, the way we have constructed life to be? Will we respond to God's new thing out of our own self-interest, not wanting to be transformed because it means we might have to give up something, some idea, some position, some way of doing things, perhaps even some power, some authority? Or will we see the star as a luminous moment when an important truth suddenly becomes clear and we can, in that moment, reinterpret our past and rethink our way forward in light of it and be grabbed hold by it, venturing out to follow it, embracing it as the wonderful transforming power of God's presence, revealing God doing a new thing in our lives and the lives of all people? Will we shout, God is changing the world? Isn't that great? How can we go out and participate in it? Will we bring what is most valuable to us and leave it at the manger, confessing, you are the Lord of my life? How may I glorify you today? Amen.